So, thank you so much for listening to Blue Sky Radio today. This is Radio Waterloo. You can find us at 102.7 FM in Kitchener and Waterloo, southwestern Ontario. Today's, oh my goodness, it's May already, and it's May 2nd. We have with us from the United States, Captain William E. Simpson, who is a wild horse advocate and a lot more. I'm going to read a quick bio. Author and adventurer, Captain Bill is the proverbial Renaissance man, a retired U.S. merchant marine officer, commercial airplane and helicopter pilot, master scuba diver, gemologist, university instructor, specialist in long-term off-grid survival and disaster preparedness. In 2013, Captain Simpson appeared and helped produce an episode of National Geographic's hit TV show Doomsday Preppers, Season 2, A Fortress at Sea, and is known as the best prepper. He's also an inventor with several U.S. patents and novel business models to his credit. Simpson's first book, The Nautical Prepper, was the first of its kind, while dozens of other articles focus on disaster preparedness and occasional op-ed pieces. His work has been featured and republished via numerous magazines and websites, and he has been a featured guest on various disaster preparedness radio talk shows. Hence, today you're on Blue Sky Radio. Thank you so much for coming on Blue Sky, Bill.
Well, thank you so much, Jenny, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with your audience.
Well, this is pretty amazing. I appreciate being connected via Lisa Dearson, actually, with the Equus Film Festival.
Yeah, Lisa's doing a great job of helping to get the messages from various media artists. You know, she's got painters and authors and filmmakers, and I think what she does is pretty wonderful. And, you know, sometimes you'll get a controversial film, but we can't punish the directors and the people that are the writers and so forth just because they get financing from a source that we don't like. I mean, we see this all the time, and you know, financing is financing. But Lisa does an amazing job, and she deserves a lot of credit for what she does.
Definitely, yeah. And sometimes it's about the message that we try to carry forward, and we, I guess, as long as we keep our mission in mind. So we share passion in horses, so that's why you're on here today to talk about horses. But let's get into a little bit about you and your background and how you and your wife Laura met.
Yeah, well, so I spent my formative years on a working ranch. It means you know, we were producing various livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs. We had a lot of chickens, both layers and meat birds, and so, you know, it was the hard life, you know, and working from sun up to sundown, and really barely getting ahead. So we were the proverbial working ranch, you know, today, and to differentiate that view or that vision, so to speak, you know, you've got commercial livestock production. It's quite a bit different. You got businessmen that wear cowboy hats. They probably don't ride horses to, you know, manage their animals like we did. They're not out there stretching fence, and they've got a lot of people working for them. So we, you know, that was my background growing up in that environment. We had horses, and you know, we did a lot of work on the animals. We lived way out in the boondocks, and so when the vet would come out, I'd have to help him do different things, and he thought I had the skills to be a doctor, and did all kinds of things with animals with him, and so we got to the point where he talked to my parents. I ended up going to Oregon State as a pre-med major, and spent a lot of time studying science there, and that's where I met Laura, and took her for a weekend down to the ranch. She rode our, you know, we had horses, of course, and of course she was hooked. She just had this natural love for animals, and had grown up in the city, but that was inside of her as a seed ready to germinate. And so anyway, that's kind of the genesis of all of it. When excuse me, when we came back from one of our 2 sailing expeditions, we decided that we wanted to live out in the wilderness because we really enjoyed that lifestyle. We had that at sea, And when we moved up into the mountains in the Siskiyou Cascade area in the Soda Mountain Wilderness, suddenly we realized we were living among wild horses.
Nice. Well, that's really amazing. Yeah, that not everybody gets to live around wild horses, that's for sure. So you kind of went in a little bit about how your passion for animals started, but how did your passion for wild horses come about?
Well, when we first got on this piece of land, we were planning on, we sold our ship, and then we were planning on building one of Michael Reynolds' Earthship homes because they're really a low carbon footprint. And then we realized that this wilderness land that we had acquired was the habitat for some native species of American wild horses. A lot of people don't realize American horses, in fact, all the horses in the world evolved in North America about 50 million years ago. And, there's various theories as to did they go extinct or not. And, of course, a lot of them did migrate across the land bridge, which is how Asia and Europe ended up with all their horses and the domestication that occurred there over about 4 millennia. But there's a lot of evidence coming to light now that some horses did survive in North America. You actually have a Canadian scientist, Dr. Claire Henderson, at Laval University. She's a cultural archaeologist that has been researching a lot of the old journals from French explorers who actually penetrated deeper into the continental United States in the early 1600s than any other explorers, and they ran into the Sioux Lakota Indians and documented the fact that they were riding horses and hunting buffalo with these highly evolved spears. And so when you look at that, these are the kind of people that if you show them 4 stone axes, they can tell you how many hundreds or thousands of years were between each iteration of the development of those axes. And so when they brought their expertise to bear on Dr. Henderson's findings, you basically can backwards engineer from the time those French explorers met the Sioux Lakota to probably arrive at an era when they started playing with the idea of using horses to hunt buffalo using these highly evolved 10-foot long spears. And so, the point here is the French observed Sioux Lakota with horses with these spears, engaged in this technology, which is what it is back then. And they said, well, this didn't happen overnight. And obviously, when you do the calculus here, the experts tend to believe that they were doing this at least as early as the 1400s. So that predates the arrival of the Vikings with their horses or the Spanish with their horses. So we have some evidence now, and then, of course, we're finding more and more fossils that are 7,000 years old and 10,000 years old. Okay, so if this extinction event happened 17,000 years ago, now, we're finding fossils that are date after that extinction period. So obviously there were horses on the landscape, and so this culmination of information is telling us that probably a lot of the horses did go away, but there was obviously it seems to be there was horses still here. So getting back to our local horses, there are horse fossils in Oregon, in California, in Nevada. There's horse fossils in the Soda Mountain Wilderness area. We believe that a lot of the horses that were in our area, Southern Oregon, Northern California, were co-evolved with, of course, the cervids in the area, the deer, the elk, and there's records that there were bison there as well. So they all made up the area. So here we are in this natural habitat and these beautiful mountains, which are lush with water and grazing. And, of course, in this area, the trophic cascades are in place. We have apex predators and so forth, so you can't engage in livestock production here. It's not like these other areas where a lot of the HMAs are, where you can engage, because over the last 300 years they've spent considerable time and money and effort to basically eliminate a lot of the predators that would take away their profitability from raising livestock. So those areas really unnatural managed areas. And when we realized that we had this really unique opportunity to do something, Laura and I are kind of looking at each other, and we bought a pretty good piece of land. It was 160 acres to begin with, and then but then we realized very quickly the land around us was old, ancient, back from the 1900s, land grant from the Northern Pacific Railroad to ranchers in the area, and then some of these families, the estates were going to sell off this land, so we decided that to protect the horses, one of the best things we could do would take the money, not build our home, figure out how to get by without a house, and then live in a travel trailer more or less, and then buy this land to keep it out of the wrong hands. And then over time we were able to aggregate a large area of land central to their habitat that has some of the key water sources and grazing. And then as we did that, we integrated into the deed restrictions that stay with the land forever now. And a deed restriction is like an easement. And those deed restrictions say that basically it has all the protections that the Wild Horse and Wild Burro and Horse Protection Act has. That horses can never be removed, fenced in or out, harassed, et cetera, et cetera. So on these lands now that we've bought for it, going forward will always be horse lands. And so the horses are protected now. And of course, over time, over these past 5 years, the horses started watching us as symbionts on the landscape. You'll see, I use the term symbiont for an important reason, because a lot of times you'll see horses, even domestic horses, with birds on their back. Well, that's a symbiotic relationship. The horse benefits from the bird removing parasites. The bird gets food, and of course the bird has the advantage of being up high on a very alert, intelligent horse's back. So if a predator's in the area, the horse will let the bird know. Mm-hmm. That's a special relationship. When the horses realized that Laura and I, first of all, we've been vegetarians since '71, so you look at Buck Brannaman talks about this at some of his horse training lectures, that it's if you eat meat, you give off odors that tell horses that you're a predator. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a vegetarian, you obviously have an advantage right off the get-go when you're training horses, or in our case, being around wild horses, because we don't smell like a predator. And so Laura and I have been vegetarians since '71 for other reasons. But anyway, the horses, after a while, decided that we were okay. And so they started investigating us, and over time we built this relationship, which allowed us to become a type of symbiont on the landscape. So some of the families have adopted us basically into the herds or the family bands, and the herd, pretty much everybody in the herd knows us, and so we're able to approach and engage in social grooming and removing ticks and things, the kind of things that you would do as a symbiont. And it's a very natural relationship. Horses are super smart, so they don't. Some people, who haven't been around wild horses, lived among them, miss a lot of the social behavior, the behavioral ecology, and don't understand that. People say, well, if they get habituated to humans, they're gonna lose their fear of humans. That's not true at all. It's kind of like your family dog. When a stranger comes, he's socialized, he or she, but when a stranger comes, they know the difference immediately. Yeah. Now, with a wild horse, you're talking about an animal that has a brain that's about 4 times the size of a dog, two-thirds the size of a human's brain, and brain, the more brain matter, the more IQ you have. They say so adult horses are might be as smart as a 12-year-old human in many ways. So they can differentiate between different people. And so, and we've actually seen where when we did that documentary, the thesis documentary with students from Colorado College, when the cameramen were following me up, the horses became uneasy because they realized that they didn't know those people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to talk to them a little bit and let them know everything was. And they don't listen to words. It's more about the tone and your body language and so forth. They look at that and listen carefully. They don't look at words. I don't think the way we do. And so, but anyway, that's kind of how all that started out. And then, as you know, coming from a ranching background and Lori's love for horses, the mix, it caused me to want to take a look deeper into what I'm seeing, because I always thought about horses from my domestic experience, with horses. That I inferred domestic horse behavior, like a lot of people do, naturally so. But then as Laura and I were around these horses more and more, I quickly realized that they're wildlife. They act more like deer. These wild horses weren't like the horses that I had on the ranch. In fact, they were very different in many ways. And so anyway, we began this study and started cataloging horses and photographing them, naming them, so we could keep track of who's who, and we were in discussions about what was going on, and doing a lot of forensic documentation, because there's a lot of myths around wild horses, as you know. And one of the things we have to do in order to arrive at a solution for the problem we have with American wild horses, we can't begin to solve the solution or address it even until we really understand the wild horses and what they do in an ecosystem. What is their behavioral ecology about? What happens with, when you take them out of their environment, you put them into, for instance, an HMA where all their naturally co-evolved predators have been removed. What happens to the horses then? And so we're documenting all of these natural behaviors and the forensics of predation, which is very important, because that enhances the gene pool and it also controls the population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow, so that is how Wild Horse Ranch evolved then, I presume.
Wild Horse Ranch is kind of, that's what we did. The name just kind of gravitated.
Mm-hmm.
We figured we didn't have a name for a ranch in mind, and so we just decided to call it all that. But
that's awesome. Yeah, what an incredible environment, and there are a lot of challenges. What about the advocacy and also the paid wild horse and burro activists? What's the difference between them, and why has there been so little progress in ending the plight of wild horses?
Well, I came into this not as an advocate. I came into it more from a ranching background that was evolved with, being taught science. I've worked as a scientist in labs and helped a lot of people get their PhDs over time, and then later traveled the world and did a whole bunch of different things. But I came into this with fresh eyes. I wasn't like part of the Twitter and all these different social media. There's really good advocates there, but then there's people that are just there because, hey, it's kind of like a bridge club or a chess club or a place where you can go and everybody has something common to talk about. And so you've got a lot of advocates who are really well-meaning, have great intentions and really big hearts, but the information available to them has been filtered by various organizations. So the BLM is managing horses under the 71 Act, and basically with what they do, they're looking at the socioeconomic pressures on land management. So you have extraction industries that want oil, they want gas, they want minerals, and of course they want to use land for livestock. And all of those demands are created by consumers. And so, you look at consumerism and the demands it places on the landscape, because that's where the resources come from. The cities don't produce a lot of product. The cities are about technology. The landscape is where raw natural products come from. And so you've got this phenomenal demand. Are Americans willing to give up? What are you willing to give up? And the real answer to that is nothing, or very little. And it's the way it is. When Laura and I became vegetarians, we realized that after I went to school, I realized to have a pound of meat on the shelf at the market, you're going to use 200 gallons of water and about 20 pounds of grain to get 1 pound of meat. Well, 1 pound of meat, might feed a couple people one day, maybe. But 200 gallons of water and 20 pounds of grain is going to feed a lot of people for a week.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're looking at if we're looking globally and looking at the human condition on the planet and in our own country, we have to start looking at managing resources a little bit better. There are areas that have been basically manicured for livestock production over the last 300 years. And so in 1971, when we formed the Act to Protect the Horses, the intentions were great. The science was incomplete in 71. We did the best we could, but you still have this overarching consumerism and demand for all these products. People want computers and cell phones, and they want gasoline in their cars, and they want their homes warm in the winter, and they want all of these things. And also, you've got 97% of Americans are buying meat products. So 3%, when Lori and I became vegetarians, 2% of Americans roughly were vegetarians. Today, 48 years later, 3% of the American population are vegetarians. So we're really not, we're not seeing people giving up much. So that's kind of the overarching background that we're looking at here. And then you've got advocates who are, being given the narrative from the BLM, which is consumerism driven. They're just saying, okay, the market says we need all this beef, we need this and that, and we're going to manage the lands, in accordance to the law, but also in accordance with the demands that are being made for products and that are derived from the landscape. So they're trying to juggle all of that. Then you have the advocacy who more of a purist approach, who says, well, the Act says you can only do this, but as we know, things have evolved a lot since 1971. That's 48 years ago. That's a long time. And so now consumerism is at an all-time high. And then you have the paid activists, who are people that are getting money from donations and to try to enforce, in my perspective, a lot of the laws that are now obsolete. And I can give you an example of what I mean. I'm not saying all laws are obsolete, but after a period of time, things change and a law doesn't make sense anymore. So you've got, for me, I crossed this bridge back in the 80s when I was over in Hawaii running a tourist business. We had aviation and boats, and we wanted to have a really nice charter boat. So I actually bought this beautiful a big cat. It was built in Canada, and we wanted to use it to take passengers out to the islands, and it was state-of-the-art. Coast Guard said you can't use it, and I go, well, why not? And they said, well, we have the Jones Act, which is from 1916, and the Jones Act was enacted to protect the U.S. shipbuilding industry, and what it says is unless the keel of the ship is laid in the United States, you cannot use that ship in any coastwise trades. In other words, you can't use it to make money. And so here I was, suffering from a 1916 law that was now obsolete, that didn't make any sense. So I went to a legislator, Senator Daniel Inouye, and I said, hey, Dan, look at this. This is not making any sense. In fact, I was flying Canadian-built aircraft in commerce, and under DOT, which is the Department of Transportation, same as Coast Guard, who licenses coastwise trade vessels. And I said, this just doesn't make sense. And he agreed. So we wrote a bill, and it was put on as a rider to a larger omnibus appropriations bill. And it passed, and my vessel got an exemption from the Jones Act. So here we are today, fast forward, we got this 1971 Act the paid activists want to see that enforced and keep pushing that position. Now, I allege that that's a bad position. And the reason I say that is knowing what we know now about genetics and molecular biology and paleontology and so forth, today, knowing what we know now, would we draw all these boxes in the same places? In other words, would we draw these HMAs and HAs in the same locations? And I think the unequivocal answer is a lot of those boxes that we drew on maps for these areas would not be relevant today. There's no logic behind it. In fact, there's science that says some of these are in the wrong places. You've got other places that are good. You look at the Priors, for instance; those are long-standing historic wild horse rangelands. But then you have other areas where there's absolutely no evidence that horses have ever been there in the past, and moreover, they're not landscapes very well suited for horses. A lot of these areas that are some of the biggest arguments are over, they're great grazing for tortoises, but, when you look at that documentary that Colorado College did up on our landscape, it's like a paradise for horses. Mm-hmm. And it's lush, it's green, there's lots of water. So the paid activists are focused, I think, on the wrong fight and have been. And I'm just going to say flat out that I've gotten a lot of input, including from an elected two-time BLM wild horse and burro advocate, a humane advocate, who wrote to me and said, Bill, he read some of my articles, and he says, the advocacy is kind of split up. It's fractionated. You've got people that have the right ideas but the wrong information. Then you got people that are motivated by money, because the controversy creates an opportunity to make a lot of money. And so we all know when money gets involved in anything, it tends to pollute and corrupt what is pure. Mm-hmm. And so the horses sometimes take a back seat to, people fighting for donations, people fighting for the limelight, which is donations. The loudest and most obvious organizations get most of the funding, in fact. So, so it's really not a good paradigm what we have today. People need to stop and step back. We're fighting the wrong fights right now, because the ground is shifted underneath everybody, and really people don't want to pay attention to that. They want to pay attention to these little details. Should we use PZP? Shouldn't we use PZP? Should we have sanctuaries? Should we not? What about roundups? So we have all these questions, but they're all questions that stem from having the wrong approach.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all really interesting, and it kind of brings us on to the topic of Wild Horse Fire Brigade, and let's talk a little bit about that, and why and how does it work, and what are the steps in implementing it, and why is it so important to implement it?
That's a good question. So, all right, so going back to what Laura and I have been observing out in the wilderness with our wild horses, and I call them ours because we love them. They're nature's. They belong to the planet. But we see the perfection of evolution. I mean, when you see it, you see it working, it just blows your mind. Interestingly, where we are in the Soda Mountain Wilderness area, there are no livestock competing on the landscape, and that's because there's a lot of predators, right? So the cattle guys, livestock people, they don't like extra costs. When you're in business, you don't want to have your costs go up, because then your profits shrink. So there are areas in the western United States primarily that are wilderness areas. That means there's a lot of apex predators. In other words, a thing called the trophic cascades, the interrelationships between all these species, from the bacteria in the soil all the way up to the eagles in the sky, and everything in between, the deer, the animals that eat the deer, and the horses, and we used to have bison. There's some now, but in Yellowstone. But anyway, those are the trophic cascades. Everything is connected, and everything needs to be there for it to work properly in an ecosystem. If you take something out, something that's evolved in that ecosystem, you've removed a critical aspect of that ecosystem, and it damages it. Now, on these other areas that have been managed extensively over the last 300 years for livestock and so forth, we see the trophic cascades have been collapsed. Okay, there's no predators, or very few. They've removed them with great vigor, so that the cost of production is low. So when we're looking at Wild Horse Fire Brigade, there's a couple things going on here. Okay, first of all, the reason I stumbled into it is that we were looking at this catastrophic fire situation on the West Coast that's evolved. And when I started looking at the forest and forest management, and growing up, I had done logging and fought fires as, working for the mill out in the woods and things, because when you're a rancher, you're never making two ends meet, so you have to take extra jobs. So we all worked at the mills and did everything we could do, worked in the woods. So when we look at the landscape, we see that there's all this grass out there now, and more than ever before, and I started looking into all of that, and it turns out that we have a severe depletion in our large body herbivores. Now, I'm not the first one to say that. Dr. William Riddle at Oregon State has many published papers about this, about the depletion of large body herbivores in the landscape, and how that leads to the evolution of catastrophic fire. And I started researching his work, and I found out that indeed, for instance, California is currently down about 2 million deer over the last 5 decades. Now, 2 million deer eat about, more or less, I'm going to round up a little bit, but about 2.5 million tons of grass and brush every year. And so these deer are gone in the last 5 decades, and so every year we have this excess amount of grass out there. And, of course, the grass is drying in a longer, warmer summer. The climate is warming, so we're getting longer, warmer summers and all this extra grass. So not only is it drier quicker, but it stays available for burning longer. Mm-hmm. And that sets the stage. Causation is not important. Well, it doesn't matter if it's a cigarette or a lightning bolt or a chain dragging down the highway that makes sparks. The point is the fuel in the forest is a problem, and that's the one thing we can control. We can't control the behavior of people. We've tried that. It doesn't work. We can't control nature, but we can control how much grass is out there, and the way we control that is with a mixed herbivory program where we use different large body herbivores in the appropriate areas. So wild horses are native species. In California, the Ninth Circuit Court has ruled that not only are they a native species, but they're considered wildlife as far as how managers need to look at them. And so what we're talking about is implementing a program where we put wild horses into wilderness areas, which will never be used for livestock production because they're too remote. The transportation, logistics, management costs are really high because they're in very difficult terrain, and because there's so many predators, that reduces the cost. So the increased cost that reduces profits. So the livestock industry will never go into these areas for livestock production. And most importantly is wild horses evolved in these areas. They belong there. We've just discovered in Europe, for instance, that the paleontologists there discovered horse fossils in the forests of Europe. And for a long time they were thinking, wild horses in Europe were grassland animals. Well, now they're finding out that horses actually migrated and survived the Ice Age by living in the forests of Europe. So they're well at home in different ecosystems and biomes. They can do well in various conditions. So Wild Horse Fire Brigade is about basically a rewilding concept that incorporates a mixed herbivory on the landscape. So what we do is we put the horses where they belong in these wilderness areas where the trophic cascades are basically depredation by their co-evolved predators control their population, But what's most important about that, Yenny, is the fact that when man tries to do gene selection, we always end up with all kinds of problems. Where we've only been on the planet for a blink of an eye.
Yeah.
Natural predators, co-evolved predators of any animal, and specifically here with wild horses, they actually strengthen the genetics of the wild horse herds. When you have natural predation occurring in the wilderness with wild animals and wild horses, the strongest genes survive. So the predators, of course, as you know, and the audience knows, predators kill the diseased animals and the old and weak animals, and the vigor of the species is thereby preserved and put forward in the progeny. This is why when I meet with hunters all the time and talk to them about hunting, and because these young men want to go up there and kill the biggest bull deer they can find or elk, and I explain to them that's not the way to do that, because your champion bull, for instance, a farmer. If you got a rancher or a farmer, he's not going to go outside and shoot his prize bull to make hamburgers. He's going to take a steer. He keeps the proven genetics for breeding. Well, we need to employ that kind of husbandry in our wildlife. We don't want to let hunters go shoot the champions, because when you see a majestic elk or deer with the big rack, he's an animal that has survived the lions and has survived the diseases and has really solid genetics. So you want that animal out there breeding. And it's the same thing now, full stop, if we have wild horses in areas like sanctuaries where mankind does the picking and choosing using castration, a PZP, and Gonacon, whatever it is, we do a lot of damage to the horses that we don't even know we're doing, because, first of all, we're affecting genetics, and a lot of the genetics we don't even understand yet.
Yeah.
For instance, I've been communicating with Dr. Mark Zabel. Now, Dr. Zabel is the associate professor at the Prion Research Center. He does a lot of work with chronic wasting disease, which is, as you know, expanding on the landscape, and is in Canada and in the United States. And it's a deadly disease. It's fatal in every species, and basically it's not a bacteria, it's not a virus. A prion is a misshapen protein, and when it gets into an animal, it causes the other proteins to template incorrectly, and it causes plaques. And anyway, it's fatal. It's fatal. When cows get it, they call it BSE or mad cow. When sheep get it, they call it scabies. In deer, it's services called chronic wasting. But the reason I brought that up is because horses are resistant to prion disease.
Wow. And
Dr. Zabel says we don't even know which allele in their genetics, we don't know which allele is responsible for that. There's so much work we really need to do. How did that resistance evolve in horses? And what benefit do horses have in the landscape? Because now Dr. Zabel also suspects that the prion disease is spread, the vector is grass and brush. So when you remove the herbivory, if you look at the herbivory on the North American continent, 300 years ago, we had about 100 million more large-bodied herbivores, and they were probably consuming maybe 3 billion tons of grass and brush a year. So that's a lot of vector for, what Dr. Zabel suspects is for CWD, or chronic wasting. So now, since those resistant animals aren't grazing it down, there's more opportunity for animals to contract the disease. And moreover, in these areas that are highly managed for livestock, which have been made devoid of apex predators, when you have cervids, deer, and elk wandering around out there, when they get sick with chronic wasting disease, they get to walk around for a long time and contaminate more area and more animals. Whereas in a wilderness area where you have a very vibrant, robust predator population, they immediately kill. They sense an animal's becoming ill, and they kill it immediately and eat it. Well, then it doesn't doesn't contaminate the landscape. It doesn't spread the disease. So we have to really take a very objective view on how we're managing wild horses or wildlife.
Yeah.
They're not pets. They're not domestic horses. They're very different. So we can't infer domestic horse management on wild animals, wild horses. So when we talk about Wild Horse Fire Brigade, we're talking about a rewilding campaign to put these horses into natural ecosystems where we have fully functional trophic cascades, where their co-evolved predators are there intact, and where everything works the way evolution had planned. And in the process, the big benefit is each wild horse that we put out there that starts grazing, fire grazing, getting rid of the grass and the brush. Each horse eats about 5.5 tons a year. That's a value proposition for taxpayers in America and in Canada. That's a real value proposition, because in these wilderness areas that are burning and producing all this smoke, I mean, this is a bad thing for the climate. When you combust all this vegetative material, all the carbon that was sequestered in these plants goes up into the air and in the atmosphere, and you've got all these hydrocarbons and greenhouse gases, and that's a bad deal for us, okay? When you've got grazing animals out there, they keep all the carbon compounds sequestered in the soil, which is a good thing. But, you look at when you put horses on a sanctuary, for instance, that has to be subsidized. Now, you've got the BLM has their new, 10 years to AML proposal, and that basically is a government-subsidized sanctuary program. This is nothing new, but the reason they're kind of, I guess, couching it as a sanctuary program is because a lot of people feel, they've got kind of warm, fuzzy feelings about sanctuaries.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, sanctuaries are just a Band-Aid.
Yeah.
The reality about a sanctuary is you right off the bat, you've taken the horses, rounded them up, separated them from their families. That's very stressful. Horses are treated, the BLM or U.S. Forest Service usually treats the horse. They castrate stallions and so on and so forth. And then the sanctuaries may get them, and then they're put into a confined area. And it doesn't matter if it's a large or very large confined area. It's nevertheless a confined area. And a lot of these sanctuaries are not in ideal ecosystems for the horses. There is no natural predation going on. Not that it matters anymore, because you've already basically domesticated the horse. As soon as you take that horse and you start doing things to that horse, castrating, treating, now you're domesticating that horse. Micah Harris at Friends of the Animals wrote an article about this, and he says, if you take a horse and you round it up and you start doing things to it, is it really wild anymore? And he alleges that no, they're not. Now you've taken the first steps to domesticating these horses. So, do our sanctuaries have wild horses on them? I think there's a really solid argument that says no. Those are now, they've been treated, they've been separated from their families, they're no longer in their wild environment. As soon as you take them out of the wild and you put them into that and do these things, they're really not true wild horses anymore.
It's the step up from euthanasia, basically, or slaughter.
Yeah, and again, now, yes, is it better than getting a bolt in the head and falling under the cleavers of butchers? In a way, it is, but there's an argument too that wild horses have to be free. That's part of their spirit. That's who they are.
Yeah.
I mean, when you take a horse out of its wild environment and you put it in a sanctuary, basically what you've done metaphorically is you've given that horse a life sentence for being a free animal. You've confined them. Yeah. It's a life sentence. They're going to walk around they're never going to be reintroduced in the wilderness. And after they're treated that way, castrated and treated with different PZP and Gonacon, what have you, they're never going to be the same. And it's kind of a sham, and it has to be subsidized.
Yeah.
Now the government is paying. You've got all these ranchers that have land that's kind of quasi suitable for livestock production, and you look at that land and it's, can they make money with livestock? Maybe. Can they make more money taking horses from the BLM? Absolutely, because the government will pay if you'll hold these horses. So you've got all these guys that are doing the calculus now that have this land that's really marginal land, and it's fenced and it meets the criteria, and they're going to take these horses and they're going to put them out there. And by doing that, they're basically divesting the existing wild horse population of its diversity. We're taking away valuable genetics, and we're doing it randomly again.
Yeah.
Here's the hand of man affecting evolutionary biology. We're not good at this, and we need to start admitting our failings. So that's the one thing that the paid advocates, they go, well, okay, PZP, we'll get these horses and we'll control population on the Virginia range with PZP. Okay, so now you're making them domestic horses. You're imposing mankind's idea of how these horses should be managed. These horses are no longer going to be real wild horses, because now you're imposing these artificial constraints and you're drugging them, like Michael Harris says. Wild Horse Fire Brigade is fresh and it's new, because for the first time we can demonstrate we don't have to do the negative things to the horses and do it at a cost to all these taxpayers, or in the case of some of the original sanctuaries, the generous donors, the people with the big hearts out there, the advocates who love wildlife and love wild horses, that are giving some of their hard-earned money to these sanctuaries because they want to keep them from going to slaughter, and I understand that. But the ideal solution is to put them into the wilderness.
Yeah.
That's the ideal solution, because then they're worth $72,000 each. Each horse we put in the wilderness that does into a fire abatement role, it provides $72,000 over its lifespan and fuel abatement. And that number, the way we came up with that number is we went around to different agencies. I even talked to some Mennonites, and I said, hey, you still clear your land by hand. How long does it take? And if we're paying, just minimum wage people to go out into the forest, not that you could do that, it's really impractical, but we have to come up with a number somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So if we looked at the manual labor using a scythe, we've looked at prescribed burns, what that costs per acre. We've looked at the mechanized methods, and of course, these methods are not even practical in the wilderness, but they do give us an economic value for that treatment, that
Mm-hmm.
fuel treatment.
Yeah.
And so, what is it worth? Well, we've done the math. Each horse does 5.5 tons a year. Average wild horse lives 20 years. You get to $72,000 really quickly.
Wow, that's incredible.
And what's nice about it is they evolved out there doing this anyway.
Yeah.
So we're not asking them to do something new. They've been doing it for millennia. And they're also they reseed the ground. We've got these big fire scars. Canada's getting big fires. And you get these areas that are all burned off. How do you reintroduce the plants? How do you recondition that soil that's been baked? You've got at these new high temperature fires, and I use the term catastrophic wildfire quite a bit, because they're catastrophic due to the extreme heat that's produced.
Yeah.
Anybody with a wood stove or a fireplace knows that if you fill your wood stove just completely up with kindling and you light it, it'll turn the stovepipe red. But heavy fuels don't do that, because the heavy fuels burn cooler. They burn longer, but they burn cooler than kindling. And so these horses can go out there, and when they're grazing on the periphery of these damaged soils, when they move out into the other areas, they not only reseed it, but their droppings are nutrient-rich humus.
Yeah.
And so they really condition the soil.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing they do in the wilderness when they're grazing, and we've documented this, and we've actually experienced the result of Wild Horse Fire Brigade in a fire, is they use trees for shelter. And so when horses use trees, of course they graze the grass and brush under the tree right off the bat. But then because, they're a heavy animal, they, nominally weigh 1,000 pounds, when they rub against the trees and scratch, they break off all the fire ladders, all the low-hanging branches. They break those off, and they dry and crumble and trample. And so the tree is clean. Most of the trees where horses will that they use for shelter, you'll see that they're clean about 5-6 foot up in the tree, and the ground underneath them is clean and it's fertilized. You'll see horse droppings. Now I've taken pictures in the actual area where the fire burned, and there were trees that survived. You can see them from a distance; they're still green. So you go up to the tree and you go, "What happened here?" And you look at the ground and you see horse droppings, and you see that it's been grazed off, and the fire burned right around the tree, or in some cases, kind of just went, a flame height, couple inches tall, went under the tree and past the tree. Tree survived. And then the contrasting picture is the trees that weren't used by the horses that are, 150-foot matchsticks. They just, all the grass and brush kindled the fire ladders, and it just went up the tree and killed the tree. We're deforesting the western United States right now because of these catastrophic fires. And our current forest management paradigm at the U.S. Forest Service, you've got all these forestry students coming out that are going into the forest, and they're not connecting the importance of wildlife. And trees produce the oxygen we breathe.
Yeah.
You've got, people, you look at these big forests on the planet, and they're slowly disappearing. The Amazon's disappearing. It makes about a third of the oxygen on the planet. You got the boreal forests and so forth. We've got to protect our trees because the trees are also the habitat for all this other wildlife. And so it gets into this intricate web of life in the wilderness. The wilderness areas we have right now, we can continue to have these if we protect them properly, and putting these horses into the wilderness is the step we have to start taking now. And we have to do that urgently.
Yeah.
And so it's troubling to me that some of the paid advocates want to look the other way, because if this becomes the paradigm shift, it will, in some cases, it will disintermediate their basic, they're in business. They're paying themselves salaries to do what they do.
Yeah.
I mean, you read their 990s, and right on there they designate they're paying themselves salaries to advocate for the horses. If the horses are largely preserved and saved in the wilderness, what happens to their jobs?
They become obsolete. But the wild horses, that would be the reason why they should advocate to begin with. A lot of people do it for free, so.
Yeah.
Question, who is involved with the Wild Horse Fire Brigade and why?
Okay, so we've got a lot of people that were longtime advocates, kind of following the drum of the paid advocacies, who have shifted over. And then we've got, for instance, and then we have advocates that actually represent small herds or groups of horses. Carla Bowers, for instance, has been a long-time advocate for the Devil's Garden wild horses up in Modoc County. That's the U.S. Forest Service herd. She's jumped on board, but we've got a lot of scientists. We've got a lot of advocates out there that see how after millions and millions of dollars have been paid into the fight with paid advocates over decades, where wild horses are entering their darkest hour. It's just now the BLM in wholesale fashion is going to warehouse all of these horses. They're going to be the walking dead on these gigantic so-called sanctuaries, okay? And there'll be very few horses left they'll bring them down to populations of, let's say, 50 or less on some of these HMAs, and those are herd that a population that size will inbreed, and basically that'll be the end of the wild horses in America. So we've got a lot of regular advocates who see the handwriting on the wall. They see what we've been doing isn't working, so they're moving over. Now we also have foresters and we have land managers who realize the threat that wildfires are presenting to public health and to our forests and to the wildlife and the watersheds, and realize that these horses can provide a service in these unique wilderness areas that there's no other way to do it. Then this natural herbivory is the only way we can get this done. So all of those people are jumping on board. So we have quite a few supporters now. Basically, I know that the BLM asked for nominations for the Wild Horse and Burro Advisory Board, and I saw a lot of nominations coming my way from county commissioners, agricultural commissioners in California counties. So they've been reading my work, and they're thinking, well, hold it, this is just a no-brainer. We can pay people a whole bunch of money to warehouse these horses right out of our own wallets. These are tax dollars. Or we put the horses in the wilderness where they belong anyway, and we get value, and they benefit the forest. I mean, how simple is that?
Well, wildfires are affecting us here in Canada as well. On the west coast in BC, they had something like 500 fires going at once and had to declare an emergency situation. So, I mean, it's affecting us here as well. Bill, what is the ultimate vision for American wild horses using Wild Horse Fire Brigade?
What our vision is that the public will be able to go out into the wilderness and into various areas that we set up these wilderness areas for recreation. I mean, they're for the people. And so people would be able to go out there and see the ecosystem with wild horses in it just the way it was 500 years ago. So let's say you're on the Pacific Crest Trail and you're hiking through the Six Rivers National Forest, which is one area where we would like to introduce horses. We'd like to get horses from the Modoc Devil's Garden area, which is also a U.S. Forest Service area, and move them into this U.S. Forest Service managed million-acre wilderness that burns catastrophically every 2 years, by the way, because there's not enough deer. So, people could hike into these areas. Obviously the sanctuaries are still going to have horses for people who have disabilities, who have difficulty trying to go see horses in the actual wilderness. But the vision is to know, I mean, in my heart, knowing that they're out there and they're doing well and they're happy and they're in their, they're exactly where they want to be, not where we think they should be.
Right.
It has nothing to do with what we think, because we don't even understand them really. And I mean, I have a lot to learn about horses. Now, I've been among them every day, or almost every day for 5 years, night and day. Lori and I, they see us like friends, and we've learned a lot of stuff. We have scientists, we have foresters that come to Wild Horse Ranch to actually study wild horses because of this unique environment where there's no cattle. We see on our environment that the horses do no damage to the landscape. It's pristine, and they've been there for 200 years. No damage at all. So the vision is to see it the way it was, a long time ago.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming to speak on Blue Sky Radio today. And it sounds like pretty much the perfect plan that you got, or that's out there, because it's environmentally friendly. And saying that wild horses destroy the environment just sounds like a contradiction, because it's not true. So it makes sense. And there's a lot of places that we can find out more about you. You run a column called My Outdoor Buddy, also author of Horse Talk, and you have Muckrack. We'll post these links out. Contently, you're on there as well as captainbill.contently.com. So we're going to add all of your links out. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us here today.
Thank you, Yenny. I appreciate it. Yeah, this is nature's plan. It's not my plan. I'm just saying, hey, look at how nature does it.
Well, it's a good plan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, and let's stay in touch.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
That was Captain William E. Simpson. He is a retired U.S. Merchant Marine,
And he's a naturalist, rancher, columnist, my outdoor buddy, author, horse talk. He's a member on IMDb, Muckrack. You can find him via muckrack.com/William-E-Simpson, and on Contently, Captain CAPT Bill, so captbill.contently.com. This is Yenny on Blue Sky Radio. You can hear Blue Sky Radio live on Thursdays, 12 p.m. Eastern Time Zone. And here in Kitchener and Waterloo, Ontario, you can find us on 102.7 FM. Thank you for tuning into this program. Blue Sky Radio is equine advocacy plus connecting with the communities at large.